Well, welcome back. My name is Cameron Miller, and this is a sermon for the third Sunday in the season of Pentecost. The readings for today, appointed for today, the biblical readings anyway, are Exodus 19 through chapter 19, verses 2 through 8a, and the gospel is Matthew 9. 55 through 10:8. And actually, I'm going to be talking about the readings from the Bible today as opposed to the liturgical reading. But if you have a chance to look up Love After Love by Derek Walcott, you'll not be disappointed. So, anyone who has come through an addiction or experienced the healing of a deep emotional wound such that love and wellness become possible again, anyone who's done that understands in a primal kind of way what it means to be carried as on eagle's wings, the phrase from that Exodus reading. Understand, please, we do not know much of anything about whether the story of slaves escaping in mass from Egypt is historically factual or not, but we do know it's true, truer than almost anything else we know. The book of Exodus describes the Hebrew equivalent of Jesus' resurrection and an event dating back to Pharaoh Ramses II in the 13th century BCE of ancient Egypt. The who, the what, the how, and when of all of it is unknown to historians, and it's only ever recorded in the Bible. And the Bible describes it literally as God hearing the groans and hearing the cries of slaves, and then responding to them by using the agency of Moses to bring about their freedom. But it takes a lot to defeat Pharaoh, even for God. And therein lies the drama. As we know, God throws 10 plagues against Pharaoh, and in between each one has Moses demand, "Let my people go." Pharaoh has some pretty good wizards and magicians himself, and he puts them up against God. But there was simply no recovery from the 10th plague. God sends the spirit of death to kill every male child in every Egyptian household. And in the midst of mass grief, Pharaoh relents and allows the slaves to leave. But suddenly, almost immediately, he changes his mind and sends his army in hot pursuit of the slaves. The crescendo of the story, of course, takes place when God parts the waters of the ocean to allow the slaves to escape across an inlet or a sound. Like I said, I don't know if the Exodus really happened, as in a historical event, but we do know it's true. Those who have experienced severe trauma in childhood, or who have been victimized by violence and who eventually find themselves emerging up from underneath the pressure and the weight like the buoyancy of an air bubble escaping the cold bottom depth of a lake, knows the truth of the Exodus. Those who've been held under the surface of an addiction or compulsion for years and years and years, secretly and silently suffering its indignities and exposing themselves and subjecting others to its cruelties and evils, knows the truth of the Exodus. Those who have had any kind of deep emotional wound that became debilitating and which caused their lives to feel like They lived in a small room of extremely limited possibilities, but then discovered that liberation was both possible and accessible, knows the truth of the Exodus. Who knows whether or how those slaves really escaped? And who knows who or how the way toward liberation was made available to them? But we do know how they remembered it. We do know that they remembered it as miraculous. We do know that they recognized that the way out was given, not made. We do know that they attributed their recovery to a power greater than themselves because they had tried on their own to gain freedom but had never been able to do it. The Exodus tells a story that many of us, many of you, many of those that are here, know to be a true story. We know a power greater than ourselves carried us as on eagle's wings at the very moment when we imagined that there were no more possibilities. At the very moment we thought death was the only option. At the very moment that we thought more drugs were the only option. At the very moment that we thought despair was the only option. At the very moment that we thought anger and rage were the only options. At the very moment that we thought lovelessness was our only option. At the very moment we thought that self-destruction was our only option. At the very moment that we thought there was no other options than the tragic self-orbiting trajectory we were on. And at that moment, something happened. And we emerged from out of its depths. At the time, we may not even have thought about it as a gift. We may have imagined it was our own unique achievement. But as we reflected on it, maybe even over years, it may have begun to dawn on us that it wasn't our own doing, at least not ours alone. All those somethings that took place in our lives, just ours, may have no similarities except that they were given, not made. Except that they were freed when we thought, except that we were freed when we thought it was impossible. Except that we were carried by something even stronger than our own will. Except that we did not do it all on our own, even though we imagined at the time that it was all about us. And that, by the way, is how we know that the story of the Exodus is true, whether or not it's factual. Some eagle's wings, somewhere, sometime, more than once perhaps, carried us. And we can only bow our heads and give thanks. Now, the same can be said about that funny little story from Matthew that was read today, although it's not quite a story, it's more of a description, I guess, or a profile. But what I'm interested in this little description from Matthew, is where it says that Jesus saw the crowds and he had great compassion on them. But look, his compassion was not stirred up because they had diseases and illnesses. He didn't feel sorry for them because they were poor or didn't have a lot of creature comforts. He felt compassion for them because they acted, as it says, harassed and helpless, like sheep, it says, without a shepherd. In other words, they were anxious. They were in that box I was describing, in that tragic place in which they could not imagine any options. They were harassed from beyond and felt helpless from within. And I think but that describes all of us, one time or another, or more times than once. But here's what I know. When we reach the moment, when we reach the moment of acknowledging our powerlessness over the thing that has been oppressing us, it is at that moment, that a way forward begins to be made known. We can call it miraculous if we want. We can call it strategic. We can call it psychological. It doesn't matter what we call it. We call it anything we want. But what we know is that at that moment of surrender, when we acknowledge our powerlessness in the face of what ails us or oppresses us, that we begin to see new options. Now, we hate these words, I know. We hate the words powerlessness and surrender. I cannot think of two more un-2023 words than powerlessness and surrender. Because whether we're on the left or the right, feminist or misogynist, activist or advocate, those two words are everything that we do not want to be, ever. But I'm going to go rogue here. Retrograde, actually, as in 13th century Egypt. The moment of powerlessness, when we admit to ourselves that we're not self-sufficient, that we are not self-sufficient, and that we can't do it all on our own, that is the moment when we begin to receive a vision or information or capacity or an utter gift that we needed in order to move forward. Ascribe to this phenomena of surrender whatever authority or mystery or dynamics we want. But I'm proclaiming it as true. What is the difference between a church and a spiritual community? Well, a church is an institution with a central mission to perpetuate itself. A spiritual community is a matrix of relationships between people who know and acknowledge their common woundedness, their mutual neediness, their willingness not to be afraid to admit and to share the times when they became open to a power greater than themselves. Ironically, those things that we hate, powerlessness and surrender, are the very experiences that grant us strength and power. Hanging out with people who have looked into their own powerlessness and experienced an exodus or two or three, it's what makes a community compelling. It's what makes a community healing. It is what makes a community spiritual. And that's all I got for today. Thanks for coming back, and I wish you peace.